is through to the bottom of the motherboard, and it connects to the motherboard with a plastic connector. Just want to make sure that connector's tight. That's what I did with the screwdriver just there. That connector's tight on the motherboard. So the only place it could possibly be a problem is at the end of the jack, right at that circle on the tip of the jack. So now I'm taking a file, and I'm going to scuff up the points where I'm going to be soldering on. Because if I leave it the way it is, solder might not stick that good, and I could have the same problem again. So I'm just taking a file and scuffing up the areas where I'm going to be putting solder. And then when I'm done that, I'm going to show you the points I'm going to solder. And I'll show you a close-up on the camera of what's going on. Just scuffing up that circle in the middle of the tip there. And a spot right to the edge of the tip where I'm going to be taking a piece of wire and soldering to. Just want to make sure that tip is spinning freely in there. Because if it's spinning freely, then I know that that's the problem. It seems a bit odd, actually, that tip's not making a connector with the back of that jack, but, you know, things build up in the laptop there, dust, and the metal gets a film of something on it, and it causes it to not make a connection. So I'm just going to make a hard solder point right to it. This will all kind of make more sense as you see what I do with the solder. Right now I'm just cutting a little piece of wire that I'm going to use for the job. Going to get my helping hand. Used to be helping hands, but one of the alligator clips fell off. Helping hands are an extra set of hands, basically, that you can put stuff on while you're working with solder and wire. For some reason, this camera doesn't want to focus. I'm sorry about that. Just taking a small piece of wire that I exposed the metal on both ends. And I'm just going to take a little dab of solder, put it on both ends of that wire. There's a radio solder I use. Make sure the soldering iron's hot enough to melt the solder. It is. So I'm just going to melt some solder on the two ends of that wire. Make sure the solder melts into the wire. And I have a little Scotch-Brite on the base of the soldering iron there that I use. And there you can see I just soldered two ends of that wire. Now I'm going to put solder on the 2 points of the jack where I'm going to be soldering the wire. Now one's going to be right in that middle circle that we saw before. Right in the middle of that circle. Now I'm being careful. I'm just soldering the middle of that circle, which is basically the back of the pin that's in the power jack. It's the back of the pin. And I just want to get inside the circle. I don't want to smear that solder all over the thing because that's just going to break again. I just want to solder from the inside of that pin, that circle. From there, one side of the wire goes, and then attach the other side of the wire to another point on the back of that jack that has a solid connection. I'll show you. Take the wire, one end, and just solder it into that middle circle that I showed you earlier. Right in the middle of the pin there. Okay, I want to put a little more solder there because it wasn't enough to actually make a good connection. Then I'm going to take that wire, mount it right in there, and I'll show you a close-up of the camera when I'm done. then to give it a little tug, make sure that it's solid because you don't want that to come off. And that wire, was it solid? Yes, it was. And so you'll see I just soldered in the middle circle there. One end of the wire. And I'm soldering the other end of that wire to another point on the back of that jack. I'll show you in a second. And you'll see that there's solder from the middle of that jack to another point of contact on that jack, both making sure that those points are of the same connection. They're both positive. They're both red. We don't even have to mess with the ground connection, just the red connection. So basically what I did was I soldered from the end of the pin, that's on the inside of that jack, I soldered from the end of that pin to a solid point on that jack. So I know it's making a connection now. There's no looseness. It's solid. Plus you have the flexibility of that wire. So you could actually bend that pin around in the middle of the jack, and because it's a wire holding it together, you have some flexibility. It's not brittle, so it's not going to break as easy. Now it's just basically time to put everything back together. Just trying to put everything back exactly the way it was. There was a screw that was loose there for some reason. Just tighten up some screws. Fasten that tape down. Going to put a piece of electrical tape over the work that we just did. Because by putting that wire on there, that wire wasn't there before. So the laptop, when you put it all back together, because it's such a tight fit in these laptops, you can't actually create any extra lumps, balls of solder that are sitting there and expect everything to fit back exactly the way it was. So try to keep everything tight. And if you think your work that you did is going to come in contact with another piece of metal on that motherboard or in that laptop, put a piece of electrical tape or two around it just to make sure that it doesn't make a short circuit. Now, I'm just testing the connectivity, or continuity, I'm sorry, of that jack. I'm taking, you can't really see it in the camera view, I'm taking one lead of the voltmeter, putting into the middle of that jack at the tip, and making sure that it's reaching the end of the motherboard. See, I'm touching the tip there. And making sure we're getting a positive connection right through there. That way I was actually testing a ground connection there, making sure the ground is connected and making sure that tip in the middle of that jack is going to the motherboard and not touching any ground points. Just want to make sure there's no short circuits. You couldn't hear it, but voltmeters have a beep, and it'll beep when you're making a contact. So if you're touching the positive to negative, you shouldn't hear any beeps. If you hear any beeps, that's going to be a short circuit. So now I'm going to clean off the top of this plate while I have it out. Going to use the wet dry vac back there again. Blow it off. Get all the dust. I usually, again, don't dust over a piece I already dusted, or a motherboard, but I'm just doing it for the sake of the camera. It's pretty clean already. then make sure when that top plate goes on, make sure it fits properly over the work that you just did. You don't want it ripping apart the work that you just did. See how it's a tight fit there. You just want to make sure there's nothing really rubbing up against the work you did. Rubbing up against that wire or forcing that wire off of the point where you just soldered it. Just want to make sure everything fits. There it goes. Nice tight fit. And then you can start connecting everything back up. Making sure everything's snapping together properly. Nothing's out of place. That side, I still have a little bit of tension on that corner, but I think it's okay. Once we put the screws in, it'll push everything exactly in the right position. This little cable gives me a little bit of trouble, but just take your time with these things. You don't want to force or break anything, especially these little white connectors. They're not fun to put back together. You're going to have to get crafty with some crazy glue or really test your ingenuity with that when you break them. Okay, that's that one. It's that one. You don't even necessarily have to know what these do. Just put them back in the spots that you got them from. And tuck everything in. Attach all ribbon cables. This is a ribbon cable that has a little mini ribbon cable under it, so that's fun to put back together. One thing you don't want to do with these ribbon cables is bend them at like a sharp 90-degree angle. They will break. They may not look broken on the outside, but remember, there's strips of metal on the inside of those ribbon cables, and if you bend them, metal breaks when you bend it. It snaps. And they're not fun to put back together.